The thought of this child dying every day while she's having fun, humanity can't stomach that. And those are the actions that need to be punished. She abandoned her daughter.
The profound and unwavering love of a mother is often regarded as the most selfless and unconditional form of affection, bringing immense joy and comfort to the lives of her children. However, not every child is fortunate enough to experience this love, as was the case with Jailyn Candelario, whose life was tragically cut short. Despite her brief existence, Jailyn's final days were marked by unimaginable suffering, a stark contrast to the carefree life her mother, Candelario, was leading, seemingly oblivious to her daughter's plight. As we delve into the details of this heartbreaking story, we will explore the events that preceded Jailyn's birth, the circumstances surrounding her tragic demise, and the consequences that befell Candelario. The narrative will unfold, revealing a complex and disturbing tale of neglect, abandonment, and the devastating consequences of a mother's absence. To gain a deeper understanding of this tragic case, it is essential to continue watching, as the story will reveal the shocking truth behind Jailyn's short and tumultuous life. A huge thank you to our amazing subscribers and viewers for joining us on this journey into the world of true crime. We're honored that you've chosen to spend your time with us, and we're grateful for your trust and support. If you're new here, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell to stay up to date on our latest captivating stories. Your engagement means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more thrilling and thought-provoking content with you. The house on West Boulevard in Cleveland sat in silence when Candelario finally returned home in the early morning hours of June 16, 2023. It had been 10 days since she walked out the door, leaving behind her 16-month-old daughter, Jailyn, with nothing but a few bottles of milk and the four walls of her playpen. Let me rewind for a bit. On the night of June 6th, Candelario packed her bags, loaded a suitcase into her car, and drove away from her home on West 97th Street. She left behind her daughter, Jailyn, alone in the house. Her destination was Detroit, where she stayed with a man for a few days, but she didn't stay long. On June 8th, she boarded a Spirit Airlines flight to Puerto Rico. For 3 days, she was on the island, while back in Cleveland, her daughter remained in an empty house. Then, in the early morning hours of June 9, something chilling was caught on a neighbor's Ring doorbell camera. A faint but unmistakable sound. Jailyn's screams pierced the quiet night. By June 11th, Candelario was back in Michigan, this time staying with a second man. She didn't return to Cleveland until June 16, 10 days after she had first left. Cleveland police later combed through more than 600 videos from the Ring camera, piecing together the disturbing timeline. What they found would paint a devastating picture of neglect, abandonment, and a child's final cries for help. For Christelle, those 10 days had been filled with sunshine and ocean breezes. She had traveled out of state, soaking up the warmth of a beach vacation, her toes buried in the sand. She even shared the moment online, a photo of herself, smiling, carefree. "The time that is enjoyed is the true time lived," she captioned it. But while she was reveling in her escape, miles away, her baby girl was living a nightmare. The walls of the house bore witness to every moment of Jailyn's suffering. The first day, she had cried. She screamed until her tiny throat grew hoarse. A neighbor's doorbell camera caught the sound of her wails piercing through the night, her desperate plea for someone, anyone, to come and save her, but no one did. By the second day, the cries weakened. Hunger gnawed at her belly, and the milk her mother had left ran out. Dehydration set in, her body slowly shutting down. The days stretched on, an eternity for a child too young to understand why she had been abandoned. She sat in her playpen, surrounded by soiled blankets, her body growing weaker, her movements sluggish. At some point, her cries stopped altogether. And then, after 10 long days, the front door opened. Crystal was home. At 7:36 a.m. on June 16, Candelario's car pulled into the driveway of her home on West 97th Street. The house had been silent and still for 10 days, its only occupant a 16-month-old girl left entirely on her own. Candelario had traveled from Cleveland to Detroit, then to Puerto Rico, then back to Michigan, spending time with 2 different men before finally returning home. She stepped inside, the scent of decay and filth hitting her instantly. The playpen stood where she had left it, but the little girl inside was no longer the same child she had walked away from. Jailyn's body was still. Her once bright eyes were sunken, her lips cracked and dry. The blankets beneath her were soaked through with urine and feces. Her tiny fingers, which had once reached for warmth and comfort, were coated in filth. There was even fecal matter in her mouth, a tragic sign of the desperation she must have felt in her final moments. Just 11 minutes after she arrived, a call rang through to 911. On the other end, Candelario's voice was frantic, raw with panic. "My daughter's dying!" she screamed. Her sobs were uncontrollable, her words gasping between cries. Before paramedics could arrive, she rushed to change Jailyn into fresh clothes, as if dressing the little girl in something clean could erase the reality of what had happened. But no change of clothes could hide the truth. Jailyn was already gone. When emergency responders entered the home, they found the child's small, fragile body. She weighed just 13 pounds, far below what a healthy 16 months old should weigh. 2 months earlier, at a routine doctor's appointment, she had weighed 20 pounds. In just 8 weeks, she had wasted away, the effects of prolonged starvation evident in her tiny frame. There were no bruises, no external wounds, just the unmistakable marks of starvation and severe dehydration. A child who should have been growing, thriving, full of life, had wasted away in the place where she should have been safest. As Cleveland homicide detectives arrived on the scene, they found Candelario sitting in her living room, her demeanor eerily composed. She spoke in an even, measured tone, nothing like the frantic mother they had heard on the 911 call. She told them a story, a version of events meant to explain away the unexplainable. She had been home all week, she claimed. Jailyn had been sick, vomiting, and refusing to eat for a few days. That morning, she had simply woken up to find her daughter unresponsive. Her voice was steady as she recounted this to the officers, but on the floor, just a few feet away, the truth lay covered by a bedsheet. Jailyn's body, small and frail, rested beside her mother's feet, a silent, undeniable contradiction to the story Candelario was telling. The investigation into Jailyn's death moved swiftly, the horrific details shaking even the most hardened members of law enforcement. When the autopsy was completed, it confirmed what had already been painfully clear. Jailyn had died of starvation and severe dehydration, abandoned for 10 agonizing days. The weight of what had happened pressed down on the city of Cleveland, and prosecutors wasted no time. Jailyn Candelario was charged with murder. With the severity of the case, the possibility of the death penalty loomed over her. In February 2024, after months of legal proceedings, Jailyn finally stood before the court and pleaded guilty to aggravated murder and child endangerment. It was part of a plea deal, one that spared her additional charges of felonious assault and 2 other murder counts. The threat of execution was off the table, but justice still demanded a heavy price. Derek Smith sat at the defense table, his face drawn with exhaustion. As a defense attorney, he had handled difficult cases before, but this one had been something else entirely. The evidence, the images, the sheer horror of it all had weighed heavily on him and his colleague Patrick Milligan throughout the trial. "We gotta do our job at the end of the day," Smith said, his voice measured but weary. "Defend the Constitution, defend our client the best we can." Authorities had called it one of the most horrific cases they'd ever encountered. And yet, as difficult as it was, Smith and Milligan had a duty to understand the full picture, to present every piece of their client's story, no matter how dark. "Part of the job of defense attorneys is to get all the facts," Smith explained. "Try to understand the situation." During the trial, the defense had introduced details of Candelario's struggle with anxiety and depression. It wasn't an excuse, Smith was clear about that. He himself understood what it meant to battle those demons. "Yes, anxiety, depression, I struggle from that myself," he admitted. "And it is not an excuse for what happened." Smith painted a picture of a woman in turmoil, someone struggling with mental illness. He revealed that in 2023 she had attempted to take her own life. But there was something else, something more troubling. Candelario had stopped taking her medication. It had worsened her condition. possibly clouded her judgment in ways no one could fully comprehend. She couldn't articulate her own state of mind during that time, which is alarming, Smith said, his expression grim. Not only was she on a couple of different antidepressants, but she stopped taking them, so that in amongst itself is an issue. And now with the trial behind them, there was one more step left. Smith confirmed that Candelario would appeal. The wheels were already in motion. Appellate counsel had been assigned. The case wasn't over. Not yet. Christelle's parents took the stand, their faces etched with grief. Not just for their granddaughter, but for the daughter they believed they knew. They insisted they had no idea Jailyn had been left alone. They had been under the impression that Christelle was at home with her. In reality, they had been caring for her older daughter, completely unaware of the tragic fate that awaited Jailyn. "Please," they asked the judge, "show her mercy." Christelle echoed their plea. She insisted she never told them about her trip, that she had made a decision in the grip of mental distress. She described feeling suffocated, desperate for escape. According to her, the vacation had been planned months earlier, back in January or February of 2023, after she had been hospitalized for mental health reasons. In her exact words, she said, "There's so much pain that I have in regards to the loss of my baby, Jailyn," she said. "I'm extremely hurt about everything that happened. I am not trying to justify my actions, but nobody knew how much I was suffering and what I was going through. God and my daughter have forgiven me. I just ran out of the house," she said in court, "like I was being chased." Candelario has a 7-year-old daughter. But to those who had known her, who had lived near her, Christelle's actions weren't entirely shocking. Neighbors recalled a troubling pattern of neglect. One neighbor spoke of how she had agreed to watch Jailyn for a weekend, only for that weekend to stretch into a month and a half. During that time, Christelle was unreachable, refusing to answer calls or come pick up her child. And as more details surfaced, it was revealed that the 10-day abandonment in June hadn't even been the first. Just before her trip, Christelle had left Jailyn alone for 2 whole days, setting the stage for the even greater horror that was to come. The court was unmoved by Christelle's explanations. The judge made it clear there would be no second chances, no possibility of redemption. As Elizabeth Mooney stood before the courtroom, her voice wavered. A seasoned forensic pathologist, she had seen her share of tragedy, but this was different. She took a breath, steadying herself before she spoke. Jailyn experienced the most extreme separation anxiety between 9 and 18 months. She began, her eyes dark with the weight of what she was about to describe. For days, Jailyn felt that fear, that abandonment, and then came the pain. The room was silent, the air heavy as Mooney recounted the child's final days. The suffering she endured didn't last for mere hours, she continued, her voice tightening. Not even just a day. It went on for possibly a week. An entire week of starvation, of unbearable thirst, of waiting for someone to come. She paused, fighting back the tears welling in her eyes. "This kind of suffering," she said finally, "is beyond what any of us could ever truly imagine." The courtroom was silent as Christelle Candelario stood before Cayuga County Common Pleas Court Judge Brendan Sheehan, awaiting her fate. The weight of what she had done hung heavy in the air, the details of her crime still raw, still unbearable. Judge Sheehan looked at her with a stern, unflinching gaze. When she spoke, her words were sharp, each one cutting through the tense atmosphere. "You left your child trapped in a tiny prison while you were out having a good time," she admonished. Her voice, steady but filled with unmistakable disgust, echoed across the courtroom. "The bond between a mother and a child is one of the purest and most sacred bonds," she continued. "It's a relationship built on love, trust, and unwavering protection. You committed the ultimate act of betrayal." The reality of Jailyn's suffering had been laid bare in the trial. She had waited, helpless and alone, for 10 days, crying, starving, slowly wasting away in the very place that was meant to keep her safe. "That little baby persevered, waiting for someone to save her," Sheehan said. "And you could have done that with a simple phone call. Instead, I see photos of you on a beach while your child was eating her own feces in an attempt to survive." The courtroom remained still, the horror of his words sinking in. There was no defense for what Christelle had done, no justification, no excuse. Then came the final blow, the one she could never escape. On March 18, 2024, the gavel struck, sealing her fate. The sentence was handed down: life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no escape this time. Just as you didn't let Jailyn out of her confinement until she died, so too you should spend the rest of your life in a cell without freedom, Sheehan declared. Her voice was cold, resolute. The only difference is that prison will at least feed you. As the sentencing concluded, a final tribute was paid to the little girl whose life had been stolen too soon. Lead Detective T.G. Powell stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. He had spent months piecing together the final, tragic moments of Jailyn's short life. Now, he had one last thing to say. His voice quivered as he read a poem he had written in her memory. J is for the justice that will be received today. A is for the angel wings she earned on that dreadful day. I is for the incremental repetition buildup of suspense for a death that clearly makes no sense. L is for the lack of love while alone for 11 days. Y is for a young life that was taken away. N is for new eternal life Jailyn gained on that day. No child should ever have to die this way. Tears welled in the eyes of those listening, the weight of the tragedy settling into their bones. Jailyn had been forgotten once, but now she never would be again. I'm sure you enjoyed this great piece of storytelling. Thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to stay up to date on more breaking news, compelling stories, and thought-provoking updates, please consider subscribing to our channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to ensure you never miss a new video.